So there's this thing that I've heard multiple people say, but I don't know who they're quoting because it's always an unsubstantiated quote. It's always, they'll say some famous person or some person of antiquity, some scholar, they'll bracket it that way. But they'll say that it is impossible for a society that is built on hate to create things of beauty. And like I said, I don't know who they're attributing that to because they never attribute it to anyone. They just say somebody said this, and this could be very well, this could very well mean that they're just quoting each other. I don't know. But I've heard probably 5, maybe 6 different people say this from different cultural backgrounds. And what they're saying is, and actually, so let me back up just a little bit. The first person that I ever heard say this was actually giving a lectural course on the Weimar Republic, the fragile democracy that preceded the rise of the Third Reich in Germany. He just says that, and he didn't quantify it either, but he was mentioning how, on the one hand, of how the mustache man struggled in his art forms, that he would make these landscapes, urbanscapes, but he struggled to be able to draw the people in those scenes with any kind of accuracy or precision, but he drew the lines and such of the buildings with a decent amount of detail. And that as you begin to see the society of Germany pivot into what it would become under his leadership, that there's this noticeable decline in art quality over that period. Specifically, in that, of course, it's a short-lived period of time anyway, but even still, it's notable that they were still building large structures and things, but it gave rise to this form of brutalism that was just straight lines of concrete and things that it's just highly pragmatic, very little ornate attention to detail, like what had preceded it, like let's say during the German Reformation, in which they were building these magnificent cathedrals, the city of Dresden, some of these things that had preceded the Third Reich and its takeover. He also, this same individual, he was also remarking on how the same thing kind of takes over in the Eastern Bloc of the USSR. After the Iron Curtain falls, that most of the architecture that begins to be constructed during that period of time also had this very stringent, brutalist approach, that it was just straight lines of concrete, very simple beiges and like grays and things like that. Not a lot of what we would consider to be beauty. And just as a side, something that I've been doing a little bit of a deep dive into, a little bit of a learning process into, is Chernobyl, which we all know what it's famous for, but how the reality is that in spite of attempts to cut corners to limit costs of the project, due to cutting corners, one of the things that ended up happening is second-rate, inferior, and insufficient materials that then had to be replaced, and that ended up costing even more. And those cutting of corners, usually the first things that would be subtracted from the budget as base requirements, fundamentals, began to just kind of balloon in their costs, is anything that was ornate, anything that was intended to be just simply beautiful or aesthetic. What am I saying? I don't think anyone would contest this, that the finest age in Western art was the Renaissance the medieval period, and the Reformation. Just, I don't know if there's anyone that would contest those things, that the art coming out of Italy, France, Germany, and England during that specific period, Spain, that was the finest age of Western art. That the next age in which we would really start taking note of the things being produced would probably be across the pond when you come into the American age of the Gilded Age, maybe, or you would have the Harlem Renaissance. It's not called that by accident. It's a literal callback trying to say that this is on the same level or the same level of prestige as what had preceded it. And that during the Renaissance, you have this revival. Literally, the Renaissance means a renewal or a revival of interest in classical forms of art, especially Greco-Roman forms of art, and the carving of marble statues, the painting of oils, and things like this that results in the Sistine Chapel of Rodin and Donatello and Leonardo da Vinci and all these very famous names, that they're producing the greatest artwork that maybe has ever been made by any cultures, but specifically of European culture. And that you have, like, for instance, the marble netting, which if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it. Marble netting. It's this one specific artist. It's basically considered to be the apex of stone sculpture during this period, in which he managed to create a fisherman's net out of carved stone, in which he actually tried to enlist the assistance of another master artist to help him finish it, because the obvious and the minute detail required to make something like that resulted in it being over budget and behind schedule. And when he came in to assist, he looked at it and he says, I don't want to touch that. I don't want anything to do with it, because if I make a mistake and I ruin the whole thing, that I don't want that failure on my record. And so he ended up having to finish it by himself and everything, but it is just captivating to look at. And then, of course, you've got Michelangelo, maybe the most famous of all of these, with the Sistine Chapel, with the Statue of David, and so many other things that he made, and how remarkable that they truly are. And the thing about it is that there's a lot of misinformation that swirls around this period of time, most of which has to do with the idea that this age is a rejection of, or a despising of, or a refusal, or a beginning of a deterioration of Christian influence that allows the intellectual space in culture for this art to develop. And that's false. The reality is that it's not a mistake, that it's the Sistine Chapel, not the Sistine Library, right? That most of the artwork that was financed, that was sponsored, that was built and made and carved and sculpted and all and painted and all of these things, like most of that artwork came with a signed check from an officer of the church or some the various political entities that were tied to religious institutions. That it's the love of God, the desire to worship God, the intention to serve God wholeheartedly, that was an underlining foundational motivation for these things being commissioned. And in fact, many of the artists themselves had complex, let's say it that way, complex relationships with religion that can't just be put into any one category. But the reality is that Christianity and love and things like that, they were deeply woven into those art forms, artworks and those masters themselves and their own motivations. Why am I bringing any of that up? Because of the presupposition, the idea that a culture of hatred can't produce things of beauty. And I think that we actually get to see a little bit of that now, that you see a lot of destruction in today's society, of the tearing down of effigies and images and statues and things of past historical figures. And you can argue about that all day. But what we have now is, in Times Square, someone put in a statue that's of this African American woman that is unknown, as far as I know, that has no known specific attributes or achievements or things that are causing the statue to be put in place. It's just a statue for statue's sake. In contrast to that, you have like the Museum of Natural History in New York, where they took down Theodore Roosevelt's bronze statue. And it is, like, you can count the hairs in his mustache. It is so finely detailed. And it is, I mean, it's a perfect likeness of him. And there's many other examples of that when someone has a genuine affection for something, the amount of beauty that flows out of them through their affection into that work results in an object of genuine grandeur. But when you have a culture that is at the very least divided, that is torn itself in two, which is what we have right now, a very polarized, a very divided culture, but one that has a lot more hatred and a lot more vitriol flowing through its veins, the things that it ends up producing, that it demands our appreciation of, are not beautiful. I mean, Banksy is a perfect example of this, where making art and then destroying it for the sake of destroying it, thinking that's some kind of a statement, and things like that our culture as it is, because it's trying to distance itself from, is trying to dethrone the very nature of love, God himself, from the public square, and ends up producing these things that are caricaturesque, they're just not appreciable. And that in some ways, one thing that I think that it does is that it causes you to reflect on these past achievements in a different way, seeing how much more beautiful they were, how much greater they actually were, because we now live in a society that is so inferior and is producing such inferior specimens than what they made. And even though we have infinitely more resources than what they had, that's a simple fact, and that the average person has so much greater access to so much more, not only information, but tools and resources than they ever had, we're still just not making things as good, as great, as beautiful as what theirs did, with such inferior quality and access to material. And I think that should cause us to pause a little bit. We've seen this happening through film for many years, as that, like, these live action versions of former animated films that were award winning, that were pioneers in their field, and then people are making these live action versions that are just not as good. Or how you have the action movies have so heavily declined from what they once were, that they knew what they were and that they knew what they were trying to deliver. Now, not only do they not know what they are, but they also don't understand their audience or what they're trying to deliver to them and end up being rejected by everyone. So what do we suppose the lesson is here? That first of all, a culture that hates and thrives on hatred, which I don't think is a contestable point in today's society, where the easiest thing to do to get clicks, likes, attention on content is to say something that is controversial. A woman just made $500,000 after using a racial slur. That our culture loves hatred. It loves vitriol. It loves hot takes, right? It loves that stuff so much, it holds it very close. And because of that, we have handicapped, inhibited our ability to express beauty. And I think it's because we've lost our ability to perceive beauty. We don't want to see things that are beautiful anymore. We want to criticize them instead. And that has resulted in an inability to communicate beauty. That inability to communicate beauty has resulted in multiple generations now that have not held or beheld real beauty. And it's basically like it's a continuously darkening Xerox copy, like the way that copiers used to work, that the more copies you made of something, the worse quality they ended up getting, until eventually you just had nothing at all. And I think we're dangerously close to getting to that point of nothing at all. And I wonder, when we reach that point, will we even be able to realize it?